Welcome back, everyone. Hope you're having a wonderful afternoon. We apologize for the weather in Virginia. It's been beautiful all week, so sorry it didn't cooperate. This is the third and last panel of the day, Students and Peers as Resources. My name is Nancy Deutsch. I'm a faculty member here in the Curry School of Education and affiliated with Youth-Nex. So I'm going to introduce the panelists. The goal of this panel is really to have us starting to think about peers as an important context in early adolescence. So along with this idea of positive youth development and shifting the way we think about youth from a deficit model to a more positive model, this panel is really trying to think about peers that way. So a number of researchers have talked about peers as being an important socializing agent, serving important developmental functions. As Dr. Eccles noted earlier, peers are not inevitably bad. And so despite the fact that they're primarily discussed as a negative influence, I think, in sort of the popular media and pop culture. So this panel is going to present a number of ideas of ways to think about utilizing peers during the middle school years as a positive socializing and developmental asset. And issues related to peer relations in middle school. So the first panelist will be Philip Brown. He's the director for the Center for Social and Character Development at Rutgers University, and he'll be focusing on peers and school climate, giving examples of what transformative projects can look like in making a difference in school culture. He'll be followed by Michael Karcher, professor of counseling at the College of Education and Human Development at the University of Texas at San Antonio. He'll be focused on the role that older peers play in fostering school connectedness among middle school mentees. So he's talking about sort of a peer mentoring program. Clea McNeely, who's Associate Professor of Public Health at the University of Tennessee, will focus on the complexity of understanding peer relationships. So really how relatively little we know in this area. And finally, Linda Scott, who's the Director of High School Curriculum and Instruction for the Chesapeake Public Schools in Chesapeake, Virginia, will be highlighting two particular initiatives, the Raising Student Voice and Participation Initiative, as well as a student tutorial initiative that focus on the way that peers serve as a positive role in the middle schools in Chesapeake.
This is the advance?
Yes.
Good, just testing here. Well, it's a delight to be here this afternoon, and this is, in my view, this should be mandatory siesta time. So I'm trying to get my metabolism working at a level that's appropriate to being able to address you. But the other reason I say that is that it seems to me one of the things that as educators we often fail to do, and that students never cease to tell me is important, is they like to know how their teachers are doing, like what's going on in their lives. So this notion that education is a personal industry. It's not just about charts and graphs and outcomes, but we're people teaching people, not people teaching subjects, is I think a critical starting point to look at how we can relate well to our students and the importance of students' contribution to that. Well, my predecessors have made the case for me really in terms of why we should start talking about the impact on positive youth development that students can have by starting to look at school climate and culture, because that's really the social context that defines, in many respects, the roles that students play and the roles that we either give them or they take on their own. So I've borrowed a slide here from a colleague at the University of Houston, Jerry Freiberg, who I really like his way he distinguishes school culture and school climate. And even at lunchtime we were talking about how many educators have trouble figuring out the difference between the two, and even some of my colleagues at the National School Climate Center don't fully agree whether they should be separate concepts. So I think it's useful to separate them in some respects. If we look at school culture as holding the values, norms, and traditions that define how a school sees itself, and school climate, a bit more complex, but it really is the more lived reality of what it's like to be in the school in terms of the kind of dimensions you see there, the physical dimension, which is not to be underestimated, intellectual dimension, but most important in terms of my remarks, the psychological or social dimension of school climate. What I want to suggest is that, first of all, it's very powerful that we think about this as the context before we launch into program choices. And the simplest example that I can think of is that bullying prevention is a national priority right now, and the only programs that I know of that have had any impact on preventing or lowering rates of bullying are focused essentially on school climate and culture. No other programs really are impactful. So that's just one simple signal of that. Secondly, that there really is a reciprocal relationship between school culture and climate. And the research I've done over the last 8 or 10 years, one of the things it's shown me is that, interestingly enough, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference which end you start on. That is, you can impact the climate by changing the culture, and you can impact the culture by changing the climate. An example of that would be, for example, that if you look at explicitly defining the core ethical values and core performance values of a school and actually use that as the basis for a code of student conduct, for how values are taught in the curriculum and so forth, that can have an impact on the climate, even though you're starting from the mission statement and that part of the equation. On the other hand, you can have a school culture that changes because people have invested in changing the climate, even though you might not explicitly realize that you've changed the norms and values you have. So I think that's the first important point here, is that we need to, it's important to pay attention to this and to be explicit about our choices rather than just taking it for granted that the culture is something that will take care of itself. So what are some of the dimensions of, look, now the whole slide is there, that's nice. You can see that the school climate is the physical, emotional, and intellectual health, and so forth. So what are some of the characteristics of a positive school climate? First of all, it fosters youth development and supports people feeling socially, emotionally, physically engaged. And also expects and supports that educators model and nurture the values that they expect in their students. So the notion of teachers as models for the kind of behavior that they expect of their students is very important. And if you're teaching respect and you talk about it in terms of the students, and the students come back and say, yeah, but what about the bully that I have as a teacher? You know you've got problems that the adult community has to address. Next, in terms of the importance or the potency of this, one slide to illustrate that. This is a study where Ohio took on a project in a number of schools, a significant number of schools, in adequately assessing their school climate, and then looked at that in terms of graduation rates over a period of time. And what you see here is the very clear relationship between the positive school climate and later graduation outcomes for kids. So does it matter for kids? Absolutely, it matters for kids. The single most important concept in my mind in terms of looking at as a starting point is the notion of social trust. In my mind, social trust is really I see it as the glue of school climate, and there's a lot of research to back this up, which really started in many respects with James Comer's work, as well as Bryken and his colleagues that are referenced here. The important point here, I think, is that the very last point there, facilitating the caring and support of staff relationships has to be as much a focus as working just with students. Because if the adults in the school do not understand what their mission is and are not getting along and don't understand the importance of this, it's very difficult for them as a school. It's very difficult for a school to make changes, even though good things may be happening in individual classrooms. So my summary of this is that the good schools I've been with, they function as small communities and large families. And that sense that of being bonded like a family can be bonded has to start again with the adults, and once they get it, it begins to trickle down into the whole classroom and classrooms in the whole school. Also, I want to point out that the notion of professional learning communities we found to be very powerful in terms of going head-on against some of these structures in American education that prove most disastrous in terms of giving people the kind of time to do this kind of work. So what does school climate change require? It requires It requires, first of all, involving members of the school community, including students, in the process. So if it's comprehensive, it's got to include the students, and that's what really this panel is all about. And here's some examples of the kinds of ways in which students themselves can contribute to school climate improvement processes. Assuming that you're going to be doing some measuring of the school climate, which is one of our recommendations, they can actually assist in the climate assessment and improvement process itself. They can interpret findings, present findings to students and to other groups. They can identify what's meaningful to them in terms of the findings, and then begin to look at ways in which they can contribute to changes in the school that are implied by the data. And respect between students and faculty is one of the things that usually comes out in those kind of data. So these are examples of how we can begin to involve students directly. And as members, and treat them as true members of the school community, not just subjects in our institutions. So the rest of the presentation, I want to focus on two particular windows into how to create a pro-social context that we found to be useful. The first notion is we want to look broadly at the notion of student voice, and to give you a resource there to look at if this is something that really interests you. And then look at service learning as a pedagogical approach that can be very effective, and it actually has the power to transform school climate if it's done comprehensively. And then at the bottom of the slide, some of the developmental goals that I think we all know can happen if we do these things well. Well, first of all, the example I want to give you is from an organization called Sound Out. A fellow by the name of Adam Fleischer has put this together. And so these are a couple of slides from their website that show you how he's approached schools in terms of changing the way in which they understand the use of student voice and making it something that's significant rather than a token. So these are definitions of some of the key principles that he sees: respect, communication, investment, and meaningful involvement. And he's characterized this in terms of students' words. So these are the definitions here do not come from the adults. These come from the students' understanding of what student voice means to them. So he's trying to be internally consistent here and looking at how he's designed his website and the patterns of programming that he's recommending, so that students themselves have constructed the recommendations. The kinds of types of meaningful student involvement. You see here students as planners. That is, they can be involved, as earlier suggested, in the actual planning of the curriculum. They're resources to the school, not just to an individual teacher. They can be teachers themselves. Project-based learning is a perfect example of this, where students are involved in the beginning and really teach each other through their reports of their projects to each other. They can be evaluators not only of their own learning, but of school-wide events. They can be decision makers if they're involved in an active way, not just in a student council, but in sitting on committees that actually make decisions. I think Maryland is the only state, if I'm not mistaken, where students are actually by mandate sit on school boards, which I think is a wonderful idea. And finally, as advocates, if kids aren't advocating for their own school, then they're not really engaged in a meaningful way in what they're doing. One of the ways in which Adam Fletcher looks at the meaningfulness level is through this ladder, which he borrowed from Hart. And as you can see, it goes from students being manipulated, feeling that they're manipulated, to the top three rungs where they're actively really involved. And what he suggests is if your notion of student involvement and student voice is only these bottom few rungs, young people tokenize kids as decoration in your events and that kind of thing, that you're not really taking this seriously. So it's an interesting kind of hierarchy of meaningful involvement. The second thing we want to focus on is service learning. And as most of you probably know, this is not community service. And I think very often educators confuse community service with service learning. Service learning is a pedagogical method. It's not just doing good things for good people. And whilst there's a lot to be said for community service, if we want to have real student engagement, service learning requires a much different way of looking at how kids can contribute to a meaningful environment in the school. And so these are some of the things that characterize the service learning approach. The main thing I want to point to here is that it really provides multiple opportunities for students to develop pro-social behavior alongside the adults, so that it meets a lot of the developmental needs that we're talking about, because kids have a choice in what they're doing, but they also are actively engaged in supporting not only their own learning, but the needs that they've identified that they themselves have, as well as in the community. So service learning can be for the school as well as for the community. As many of you know, when service learning is done well, there's a lot of salient research in terms of some of the outcomes. The one thing I want to point to is that, again, in terms of whether it's real or token or not, there's a growing body of research that says that if it's less than about 20 hours involvement, that it's not going to have these kind of impacts. So if we want to have the kind of impacts the research shows, it's got to be done at a meaningful level. And I think the other thing to keep in mind here is that it's perfect for middle school kids because it hooks them into this notion of passage, rites of passage, because it really sends them the message that they can have an impact on their community by their own involvement. Well, there are four essential aspects of service learning that I want to point to. And all four have to be there, or it's not service learning. The kids need to be involved in the planning, which means identifying the needs that they're meeting as well. It can't be just a teacher-ordered service project. Obviously, they have to be involved in the activity itself. And then often underestimated is the importance of the reflective activity being taken very seriously, that it's not just a report that they do, but it's a very active self-reflection and then reflection within the community of the classroom or the school about what they've done. And that there be a real celebration and demonstration of the value of what they've done. And this is very important to kids, that they are recognized in the whole community for what they've done. And this is a perfect opportunity to have that kind of meaningful activity. Service learning can vary in terms of the kind of academic content that's involved, the context in which students are learning, the needs that are being addressed, and the community connections that are being incorporated. It's important that many schools think that they have to go outside the school to do service learning, but some of the best projects I've seen are students who've developed projects based on their own understanding of what their own school and their own population needs, which can also be a challenge to the school because it's indicating that something's not adequate there in the environment. There can be a lot of types of service learning. So this is a quick example of how a reading buddy program can look very different for a 7th grader, whether they could be working with seniors with vision problems or helping preschoolers learn to read on their own. And that's a time to point out, I think, that many kids, one of the reasons why this is so good for engagement is that it taps into skills that are non-academic in nature to some extent, or skills that some kids have who may not shine academically, who begin to look at their self-concept in a different way because of their involvement. Location, times, and numbers of students can be varied. It can, as I mentioned, it can occur inside, outside the school, involve the classroom or the whole school. And service learning as civic engagement and education, what we find is there's a reciprocal relationship here, but the two important points are, first, that the second point here, that in the process, adults learn, in the community particularly, learn to appreciate the contribution that young people can make to the changes that they want to make in their own community. So it begins to change this kind of negative stereotype often people have in the community about the kids of this age group. And lastly, that youth themselves learn that they are citizens now, in the present. They don't have to wait to adult status to actually see themselves as citizens. And that's critically important in terms of if we see that as a primary role of our school districts. And lastly, I'll finish up with an example of what this looks like in one area where they've been doing this for quite a while successfully in Michigan. This is the Grand Valley State University, which partnered with school districts where 1,500 middle and high school students annually participate in this. And in this case, the students identified water quality as a significant issue that they wanted to work on this particular year. And what they did was, first of all, they chose to address issues in their own school system where they saw that water runoff was a problem, and so they looked at landscaping practices that were going to change the water runoff and make it much more environmentally sustainable. And then they did the same thing. They went into the community and worked with community partners to design rain barrels that would hold rainwater, and then made those available to families in the community so they could participate in essentially the same goal. And finally, a couple of other resources, just to be self-promoting here for a moment. Because this is just coming out in a couple of weeks and I'm very excited about it, I couldn't fail to take the opportunity. And because it's so consistent, I think, with some of the values in the conference, there's a book that's coming out in a couple of weeks, which is a reference book on pro-social education. And the thing I wanted to say about it that's not on this handout that you probably picked up is that there are some rich case studies as well as research summaries from some of the top people in the country on all of the various kind of components that we think of as making up pro-social education, which are those. And lastly, that if you're interested in school climate, there's a School Climate Policy Institute that there's a brochure on, and we welcome you to that as well. Thank you.
Everybody, can you hear me? I don't know about you, but I've been sitting all day. I was trained as a developmental psychologist, although you might not want to trust me. Nancy Hill showed me a picture of her 12-month-old son, and I said, what is he, about 4 or 5? And the irony is I have a 12-month-old and a 5-year-old, so anyway. The purpose of my presentation is to talk about the positive influence of peers, but not to do so in a Pollyannish way. I think it's really important that we build on research that incorporates the potential negative effects of peer interactions. And then I want to talk about the use of developmental theory. I'm going to illustrate a program that I don't mean to sell. I'm just going to use it to illustrate the use of developmental theory, both to think about the tasks presented to the youth participants, and to think about how to organize their time together. Another thing I want to do is provide a definition for adolescent connectedness, and I think it's an important thing. If you don't get it after my talk, please call me. And lastly, I am a big fan of peer programs. And I'm going to talk about one that has struggled recently, and it is the Big Brother, Big Sister High School Bigs program. Is anybody here from Big Brother, Big Sister? Okay, does anybody plan to tell on me to Big Brother, Big Sister? Actually, I'm on the Research Advisory Board, and Altria, who is supporting this event, also has supported a redesign of their peer mentoring model, their peer mentoring program, because they had an evaluation that was done prematurely in 2008, and it found no effects. And it found no effects. The program really wasn't ready wasn't ready for prime time, but also the program really wasn't well structured. And so they've now stepped back with the help of Altria and others, including myself, tried to think about how to structure the matches, and I want to talk about some of that, and I hope that will be clear. And lastly, I did a study of school-based mentoring in the Communities and Schools organization that Bill Milliken started. And one of the things that we found were no effects of getting a mentor in addition to lots of other services provided by staff at communities and schools. No effects for the middle schoolers. I was a middle school counselor in Boston, in Jamaica Plain for 4 years, and so I realized the mayhem that goes on there, but I still thought we would see something. And I think the way of involving youth in mentoring programs that I'll talk about may be a more appropriate way to serve them in middle school. So if anybody knows Bronfenbrenner, or Nancy Darling, or, well, you might know this story better. So I love this story. Bronfenbrenner was at his end of career banquet, probably like this, but more people, and lots of people came up and talked about all he had done to help us think about the ecology of human development. And so then the last thing was to have him come up, and someone said, we'd like to have you talk with us about what you've learned over the last 40 years about what it takes to facilitate positive youth development. And he got up and he walked over to the podium and he tapped on it, and then he said, "Somebody's got to be crazy about the kid." And he went and sat down. Now, I've seen 2 reports of this, and so I really do believe it, but I love it. And in fact, when we developed a training for the high school bigs, these teenage high school mentors who were going to work with elementary and middle school kids, this was one of the best phrases for them, because they could confuse their task with being a tutor, they could confuse their task with a lot of things, but if we just said, when in doubt, is this kid likely to feel like you're crazy about him or her by what you're doing? If so, you're doing the right thing. I love the work of Jesser back in the 70s and 80s, and it was an extraordinarily useful framework for thinking about problem behaviors, which we did pretty consistently up through the 90s, right? And there were 2 terms that he had for school bonding and engagement. One was conventional. There was conventional engagement, conventional bonding with the institutions and the people who serve the institutions of society, mostly adults. Then there was the unconventional bonding, and that was with peers and often delinquent peers. And that was kind of the beginning, I think, or part of the movement of thinking about the negative influence of peers. But as we shifted in the last 15 years towards a more positive perspective on youth development, I think it's important to realize that these dimensions hold up, that there is a way of connecting to the present and the presence, to adult institutions and to adults that connects you with the future. And there are also ways of connecting or being actively engaged with peers in the here and now that are good. The real problem is when you have one but not the other. When you have only connectedness to peers in the present and no connectedness to adults, adult institutions, or your future, that tends to put you on a pathway that's problematic. I like this definition of connectedness, not because it's mine, but it's consistent with mine. And that is, I want to define connectedness differently than you sometimes see it. And I say you sometimes see it because I review a lot of articles on connectedness, and it just depresses me sometimes that because it's a popular term, you'll read a study that uses a scale of belonging or social support, and they'll call it connectedness. And then they try to make sense of the findings using a definition of connectedness but a measure of belonging. And it's very confusing, at least for me. But I started in '95 in the development of a connectedness scale. About 10,000 kids participated in about 5 evolutions of this. And what emerged over time consistently was that connectedness reflected active engagement in relationships, in activities, and in contexts, and positive feelings towards those contexts, activities, and people. It's about plugging into the wall. It's not about what you experience. Belonging is what you experience in a group. Relatedness is what you receive and experience in a dyadic relationship. Social support is also an experience coming in. But connectedness is about going out. It's about initiation. And I think that's an important distinction because those are 2 different things. One is to provide kids a supportive environment, and another is to get them to re-engage. There's nothing new under the sun, and I hope Joe Allen doesn't say, this guy's stealing my work. It's really not the case, Joe. I love your work, and I think your work on relatedness has been amazing and informative, and I love it. And I actually separate relatedness and connectedness. You might decide the measures aren't that separate, but the way I view it is that, and I think this is somewhat consistent with Jesser, early attachment, home experiences, lead to a sense of relatedness that kids bring with them to school. At school, they meet friends and peers and teachers, and they have an experience of being received and supported by those friends, those teachers. Now, it's partly informed by their expectations based on relatedness, but in school, they experience relatedness and belonging, and what I believe is the connectedness is the reciprocity of that. It's the reciprocation of that. I feel connected, I feel supported, I feel valued, and I engage. I move forward. Now, as Jesser showed, I can move forward to do negative things, or I can move forward and do positive things. A blend of conventional and unconventional connectedness gets us here. An overabundance of unconventional connectedness and a dearth of conventional connectedness gets us here. So we have these two pathways, deviance and positive youth development. And I just want to pause for a second and remind you that I think this is one of the most important instruction guides for people running programs, for thinking about what you need to do to avoid deviancy training in whatever context you're serving youth. It's a great book covering lots of different contexts in which there's been research looking at deviancy. Deviancy is where peers facilitate, encourage anti-adult, anti-conventional attitudes, even in the context of an intervention. So the counselor may be doing something, or the group leader may be doing something, but the kids are having a bigger effect by reinforcing one another's misbehavior. Okay. So this is a model that I don't expect you to do much with, but I love it. There's a psychoanalyst named Kohut who has a model of self-development, and it happens to be one that we use to think about connectedness and to organize the program. What I love about it is that it gets at the dimensions that Jackie Eccles was talking about this morning, and that Joe Allen and others who have focused on the importance of relatedness on one hand, and also the need for structure and competencies. In this model, in childhood, kids first experience a sense of empathy, praise, and attention from adults around them. If it's consistent, they'll develop they'll develop ambition, a drive, a get up and go. But the next thing they need is adults who act in ways that are clear, consistent, and structuring. Because without that, you develop, he was an expert in narcissism. You get all energy, but you got no consistent sense of where you're supposed to go. And his model develops into one where, through receiving empathy, praise, and attention within a context of clear, consistent structure, you identify with those folks who you feel relatedness with, and that sets you down a pathway of values and ideals and goals. Now, we all think about and agree with Erikson's stages, but Erikson talked mostly about autonomy-seeking, individual self-development activities. Aside from trust, or his first stage, and generativity, one of the intimacy and generativity, the last stages, everything that has to do with elementary, middle, and high school is about separation. And I love the work of his wife, Joan Erikson, in The Wisdom of the Senses, who writes about what she calls the weaving tension of developmental growth. And she takes their stages, I say there because she collaborated with him throughout his career, she takes his stages and then she talks about the radius of significant others at each point. And there's no better illustration of what I would call the difference between pre-adolescent connectedness and adolescent connectedness, but that the context in which a kid can move starts to expand and they have more options for connection. Early on, we've got connectedness to friends. Maybe we start to differentiate it from peers, but by high school, we've got connectedness to friends, connectedness to peers, connectedness to culturally different peers, connectedness to romantic partners. It just starts to blossom, and we start to fine-tune it. But what we don't talk a lot about is how these two are related. And I think it's really important, and it's really one of the lessons that Joan Erikson shared with us, that these early experiences of adolescent connectedness, and I'm just choosing this middle school period. Wow, we tried this out to make sure it didn't go wacky, but it did. Sorry, that thing goes over here. So pre-adolescent connectedness facilitates kids' social skills, school engagement, and self-esteem. Think about who's the kid hanging out with at school? Who are they choosing to play with? What competencies are they being rewarded for and valued for? And if they come into the relationship and they're expecting a hostile relationship and they get hostility from teachers or peers, they're going to choose a pathway and develop social skills that are probably, unconventional. And then once they've chosen these skills and start to develop a budding sense of their self-esteem, that then shapes who they identify with, who they frequent, and then that shapes their evolving identity. If you look, and maybe you pick this up, this is the handout that was available out there. It might be in your mess of papers. And if you want to refer to it, you can. What I want to do briefly is talk about, let me do one thing briefly and see if you are following me. These self-developments, Erickson's work, and this trajectory of research on connectedness, attachment, relatedness, these, for me, reflect what a program must do. A program that serves youth has to provide both of these. We were having a conversation at our table earlier on that much of what Jackie Eccles talked about this morning is so convincing, and we wonder, why aren't we doing it in schools? Why aren't we doing things that motivate youth rather than just coming down with the hammer, assessing their competence or incompetence and thinking that's going to work? It not only doesn't work for the kids, it drives the teachers out. So what we need is something that supports the kids, provides ambition, and then gives them a clear, consistent structure in which to work. I mentioned the High School Bigs program. I visited the High School Bigs program as I started to work with the Altria-funded project to sort of revamp it. And one of the things that I first noticed when I went to one of the meetings was, here are like 15 teenagers, and it looked like there were about 20 middle school kids. There was one director, and that one director was trying to do an activity. And there were 5 or 6, maybe 10 obedient little kids in the front. There were all the peers in the back talking about what they were doing the past weekend. And then there were a couple kids just running around like nuts. And, and then there was another kid who started crying, right? So then the director had to work with her and take her outside. And then one of the teenagers came off the wall, and she started to lead the program spontaneously. It was mayhem. And in fact, later on, I said, well, who was this kid? Why weren't they with their mentor? Oh, that kid didn't have a mentor. They came to the program late, but I couldn't kick him out of the program. But they don't have a mentor. And there were mentors. Oh, he didn't have a mentee because that kid dropped out a long time ago. It really was Thunderdome in there. And I really think with peer programs, we've got to provide that clear, consistent structure that is, as Eccles mentioned, something that connects what they're doing now to something that's meaningful now for their connectedness to self, connectedness to peers, connectedness to the present, or the future, but it's got to have some meaning to it. So in the CAMP program, cross-age mentoring program that I'm just going to discuss in one second, we do a lot of things. First off, we try to find mentors who will be crazy about their kids, and we've identified 2 scales that we use. One is the Adler's social interest scale that predicts whether the mentors will maintain their involvement in the program over multiple years, and another scale called attitudes towards youth. You'd think, why would you choose a kid with a bad attitude towards youth? But they make their way in these programs. And then we involve the kids from the beginning in having some choice in who they are mentored by and work with. It seems like a no-brainer, but it rarely ever happens. Rarely ever happens in mentoring programs. You're going to be spending your year or years with somebody you didn't know them before you were assigned to them. But another thing we do is in the 2-hour meeting, we climb the developmental ladder. I use Selman's theory of perspective-taking development to think about move from the kid and the mentor and the mentee articulating their separate perspectives and then trying to coordinate them over the course of 3 hours in some collaborative activity. And then at the end, we have them do reflections on the match. And we do that for 2 reasons. One, so that the mentors can help. These activity logs are both right here. These are both to assess how much they liked the activity for the day and also what happened in their match and how they felt about it. That's important because the mentors will evolve and write the curriculum, and they need to get feedback. But more important is that it trains the mentors and mentees in how to say goodbye, which to me turns out to be one of the most important things for mentoring programs. That is to structure an ending to these relationships. Half of all school-based mentoring matches at the end of the year, right? And they're not all with the cute little kids, right? So it is the kids who've had the hardest time forming relationships who are least likely to get their mentor to return in the fall. But most mentoring programs will push for multiple-year matches because of a misreading of the research that suggests that multiple-year matches are better. It disappoints a lot of kids. But we have to practice that activity of saying goodbye. In the program, what I want to show you, and it's the second page of the handout, is a second sort of developmental ladder. It's the differing roles that youth can play. We have, in the program I'm going to talk about right now, we have worked and studied the program with 4th through 6th graders who can stay in the program for 3 years. And as they move into middle school, they become protégés. They become mentors in training. Thank you. And then they become mentors and lead mentors. They can stay in the program throughout. And they can follow this path from being a mentee to a mentor to a protégé and then a lead mentor if they want. And what we find is that there's evidence that these things inform each other. The mentors seem to demonstrate improvements in school connectedness, self-esteem. The mentees experience improvements in school connectedness, social skills, and even academic achievement. But in both programs, we've also found in 2 different states that the mentoring program facilitated connectedness to parents. It was as if it was repairing and strengthening the parent relationship. And it makes me think of some of Joe Allen and Hauser's work looking at kids' attachment status and how it predicted problem behaviors later in life. And he suggests if the attachment status remains weak, those kids as adults will be, to use my words, dead, drunk, or in jail. My words, Joe. And lastly, I just want to highlight that another finding that we found, and it's also been found by other researchers, is that the effects of the program, that is this structuring over here, the effects of this program on those outcomes is mediated by the improvements in relationships with parents and teachers. So these 2 things are intertwined, these 2 dimensions, and they give us a pathway for youth development, and they show us the elements we've got to have in our programs. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for hanging in. I think I must be about the 12th speaker today, and I think we're all doing a commendable job. It was really a treat to be asked not to present specific research, but to be asked to step back and think about what do we know from the research. And when I did that, what I came up with was really a call for humility. I've been doing peer research on and off for about 10 years, and I've never, is there an echo? Maybe I'll go back. Oh, you don't hear the echo? Okay, I'm still going back because it's making me crazy. Okay. Is this okay? Okay, this is much better, thank you. I've been doing peer research on and off for about 10 years, and I've yet to have an a priori hypothesis that has been fully supported. And I was very happy to hear that the youth mentoring program, that your hypotheses are not always fully supported as well. Because we get a lot of surprising findings when we do this peer research. It's not always what we expect. So I'll go very quickly over this slide. We've seen it from Jackie Eccles, we've seen it from Vince and Farah, we've seen it from several people, that what characterizes the transition to middle school in those years is an increased importance of peers, an increase in novelty and sensation seeking, and of course, that novelty and sensation seeking, which we in public health call risk taking, is more satisfying when it's done with peers. And that makes adults very scared, and makes adults very scared about peer influences and worried about them quite a bit. What I'd like to talk about today, and a lot of this was echoed, or I will be echoing a lot of what Mike Karcher said, is the complexity of socialization in peer context. It's not just negative. It's negative and positive, and the same thing can be simultaneously negative and positive, which makes it really confusing. The implications for intervening on peer relationships, which is what we in public health try to do quite a bit, is actually change the peer relationships through peer-led programs or grouping peers or that kind of thing. And then possibly some directions that we can think about for the future as researchers. So, youth are actors in multiple peer contexts, and as actors, they both influence other kids and they're influenced by kids. And some of these include your best friend, a romantic interest, a clique, which is a group of kids who are all friends with each other, larger peer networks, a reputational crowd, such as the geeks or the jocks or the burnouts, peers that are grouped by adults, peers on social media, and of course the larger youth culture. So here we have Tomas, and he's in 7th grade, and this green dot represents his best friend. Well, unfortunately for Tomas, it's not a reciprocated friendship. He also has a romantic interest, which is the pink dot. Sorry for the gender stereotypes here. But he's very fortunate that she does reciprocate his interest. And then he's part of a larger peer group, which we call an ego network in social network analysis. And the 3 dots on the top you can see, that's a clique. Those are all reciprocated friendships. And then he has some other male friends. And then you see that his romantic interest, his girlfriend, has a reciprocated interest with his unreciprocated best friend. So there's a lot of drama happening in this ego network here. And that ego network is embedded within a larger school network. This is a real school in the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health. These are all the peer networks. And the 2 clumps on the top, the pink and the purple dots, those are the 7th and 8th graders. And then the other colored dots are the 9th through 12th graders. And you see that the 7th and 8th graders are clumped into 2 groups. And that's racial segregation of friendships. The group on the right is primarily African American, and the group on the left is primarily white. So we also know that in integrated, Jim Moody's done great work on this, showing that in integrated schools, friendships tend to be racially segregated. And then also within that school, I'm just still within the school, right? So also within that school, Tomas is looking at, he's in a school with older kids, he's looking at the beautiful people. He's looking at Michael and Maria and Tyler, and he's seeing, what do I do to be popular like them? And they may not be seeing him at all, or one of the things we know that teens do, and Joe Allen was really instrumental in this work, was showing that kids use aggression to attain status. He may be a victim of bullying of these kids, even though there's no social tie there. So within all of these different contexts, we also have many different kinds of socialization processes happening. So of course we have direct peer pressure, which is what everybody knows about, direct peer pressure. It's like, hey, come on, man, take a puff, right? And that does exist. It's not the primary form of peer influence, but it does exist, and it's also positive. Peers are also telling their peers to study for the test, to don't get in that car with a drunk driver, that really they shouldn't be asking for alcohol, that really, believe it or not, they're telling each other that they should be polite to their parents. So there is this direct peer pressure, is both positive and negative. Another very common form of peer socialization is the development of group norms. And this works, I mean, James Coleman and so many others have done this work in terms of looking at kids choose friends like them, and then they're influenced by them. We often think of selection. Is it selection or is it influence? And in fact, it's both. Another form is status attainment. Kids behave in certain ways to get status. And kids also serve as resource and information channels to each other. So they can serve as channels for where do I get alcohol or where's the party, but they also serve as resources for how can I solve my problem, and how do I study for that test, and how do I learn this material. Another mechanism is social belonging and social support, and these are thought to be universal goods. So we want more social belonging for our young people. But as I'll show you in a minute, they don't always have positive effects. And finally, social network structure, and I just gave you an example of that about how in integrated schools, peer networks are often racially segregated. And then, of course, I was getting really depressed writing this talk. So we have all these kinds of socialization, and it also varies across multiple settings. So it occurs in classrooms, it occurs in after-school programs, lunchrooms and hallways, and when kids are just hanging out. And what really distinguishes these settings, one from another, are the kind of things that Mike and Phil were talking about in terms of to what extent are adults involved in these peer interactions, or to what extent are adults guiding, positively or negatively, guiding these peer interactions. And obviously at the bottom of the list, hanging out at the mall or something like that, hanging out in the hallway, hanging out in the bathroom at school, we have a lot of peer interactions that happen outside the context of adults. And the main point I want to make is that peer socialization increases and decreases risk. And for so long, the pendulum was swung to one side, that we only focused on peers as negative influences. And in some of the positive youth development circles, I see the pendulum starting to swing solely to the other direction. Peers as empowering, peers as positive resources, peers as leaders, and decontextualized, looking at them in a sort of decontextualized way. And that also, I think, we have to think of it very holistically, and that's been a theme of the entire day, is let's look at kids as people, and let's look at these educational and socialization processes holistically. That they have both negative and positive outcomes, and I'll show that through 2 examples. And the first is, when we think about social belonging, and when you think about feeling a belonging at school, in general, that's a really positive thing. But when you think about belonging to the peers at school, that's a different construct. And it's really important to separate out the peer climate piece from the larger school climate, I think. So we measured peer social belonging and health using a measure developed by Bolin and Hoyle, 3-item measure. You feel close to people at your school, you feel like you are part of school, and you are happy to be at your school. And longitudinally over time, not surprisingly, this has been found by many, many people, we found that it was associated with lower levels of depressive symptoms. However, also longitudinally over time, kids who have more social belonging, and this has been replicated over and over as well, this finding, kids who have more social belonging over time are more likely to participate in regularly getting drunk and are more likely to smoke cigarettes. Why? Because the popular kids are more likely to engage in moderate levels of risky behaviors. They're the earlier experimenters, and they're more likely to engage in moderate levels of risky behaviors. And if you feel more social belonging, if you're more linked in, if you're more connected to these kids, you're going to feel more social belonging, but you're also going to be open to opportunities for risky behaviors. The second example is looking at social cohesion, which again is thought of as social capital. It's thought of as a positive good that we want for our young people. And in a study, all this work I'm talking about I've done with Christina Fulci at University of Nebraska. And in this study, we looked at social cohesion and found that it's associated with greater depressive symptoms in some peer conditions and fewer depressive symptoms in other peer conditions. So what do I mean by social cohesion? Here you have 2 social networks of the same size. And then on the one on the left, this is what we call a fragmented social network. So only 15% of the kids in this network, only 15% of the possible ties are with each other, only 15% of the possible friendships. Whereas the network on the right, 50% of the possible ties are with each other. And what we found, this graph shows a relationship. This is for girls. Again, excuse the gender coloring here. But the thick bar on the bottom is the relationship between having the number of friends you have and depressive symptoms for girls in socially cohesive networks. So for girls in socially cohesive networks, having more friends is good. What do you notice for the other one? As network size increases in fragmented networks, girls experience substantially higher rates of depressive symptoms. And we don't have data in Ad Health, but what our hypothesis is that this is a function of role strain. That in a cohesive network, the girls, or all the kids in the network for that matter, can share the load in terms of providing social support to the network members. But in the fragmented network, there isn't that coordination, and the role strain falls heavily on girls. And then we get to boys, and we see the absolute opposite pattern. Not as strong, but we see the opposite pattern, such that in socially cohesive networks, boys are more depressed when they have more friends, and are less depressed when they have fewer friends. And again, this is really depressing work. It's really complicated. So again, what we think is happening, I mean, we don't know for sure because AdHealth doesn't give us the data to test it, but we also know that social cohesion reinforces social norms. So if there's a norm against social support in a network, which many boys have, you might get this situation, but we don't know for sure. So in sum, social cohesion was protective for depression in large networks for girls, but not for boys. And like I said, we also know that social cohesion can also reinforce pro-delinquency norms and increase risk behaviors. So what does this all mean for harnessing socialization processes for interventions, besides the obvious point that it's challenging? And Mike already mentioned the just very famous work on deviancy training. And I want to go on and talk a little bit about Tom Valenti's work on peer acceleration, because he takes it a step further, and I think it's really interesting. They looked at, this was high schools, not middle schools, but they looked in Southern California at a bunch of alternative high schools, and they did 3 conditions in a drug prevention study. The first was a control condition. The second was an intervention where they had peer leaders, they grouped the peers, and they had peer leaders conducting the intervention, and the teachers chose the peer groups, and the teachers chose the peer leaders. And Scott Guest has shown that teachers aren't very good at understanding the natural peer leaders in a classroom. And the third condition was using sociometric data. They had the kids select their own peer groups, and then they had the kids select the peer leaders, the peers who they thought were leaders, and they led the intervention. They did this study, and they found no differences between the 3 groups. But then when they disaggregated, they found that in the groups, when they were in their natural peer groups, they found that in the pro-social groups, it accelerated the positive effect. And they had positive effects for marijuana and cocaine drug prevention. But in the groups where there was already high levels of deviancy, you had deviancy training going on, and grouping them with their natural peers actually exacerbated the effects. So I think the research implication, whether it be on a mentoring program or a peer-led public health intervention, which is what I'm familiar with, is that we need to disaggregate and look for iatrogenic effects in different subgroups. We may be missing, if we just look at the average effect, we may be missing some really positive effects of some of our peer programs. But if we disaggregate, we can get a better idea, and this goes back to like Jackie Eccles' slide of who are those few kids who are falling off in engagement of school, right? Who are those few kids for whom deviancy training may be an issue, and how can we capture this positive influence of peers for most of the other kids? And finally, I'd like to conclude with just I think an exciting opportunity is we're looking a lot at youth development programming, and we're looking at individual outcomes. And what would be really helpful is to look at how positive youth development programs or youth development features of middle school settings change the peer relationships. Like Jackie Eccles was talking about, it isn't inevitable that risk-taking increases in middle school. And it isn't inevitable necessarily that deviancy training occurs. What is it about our context that fosters that? And rather than once again going to the kids, intervening on the kids, trying to get the kids to change, what is it about our settings, and then looking at these peer socialization processes as dependent variables, to use research jargon, I think is a really fruitful avenue for us to pursue. And I'm right on time. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Somebody let this director of high schools into a middle school meeting, but let me explain. 29 of my 40 years was spent as a principal, elementary, middle, and high school. 14 of those years were spent as a middle school principal. And also I have taught college-level courses on middle-level education. Middle education is my love. I just walked out. It was a very hard exit the door of a school that was near and dear to my heart, a middle school in Chesapeake, Virginia. And this afternoon I have an opportunity, I guess I'm shifting gears a little bit with the panel, but I'll be talking about 2 school-based initiatives that we implemented at a middle school with many at-promise students. In fact, we had 84% free and reduced lunch, and 100% of our students ate free breakfast. Not knowing who was going to come before me, I had looked at framing my presentation, and so I'll go through some of this very, very quickly because we've heard it and you know it. Youth are more likely to graduate high school if they are connected to their school community and have a caring and respectful, they're caring and respectful with their peers, and they experience that also with the adults, that they have peers and adults who will listen to them and respond to their needs and voice. In the Breaking Ranks framework developed by NASSP, or the National Association of Secondary School Principals, this is some of what's involved in the personalization area of that framework. Students need real opportunities to help others. We heard that. They need to learn through engaging instructional activities. They need to have opportunities to be part of a group, and that is a very strong developmental need. And at the school level, we would always talk to parents and say, let it be our group, let it be a church group, but not the group on the street. And I would also say to our teachers many times, if we did not provide collaborative experiences during the instructional period, that these adolescents with such a strong developmental need to be social will rob that classroom teacher of that time. So we must plan for those lessons to be collaborative. These are all fundamental resources and structures that the young adolescent needs. And when benefiting from these resources, they are more likely to avoid the violence, more likely to contribute to their communities, and achieve higher grades in school. Peer relationships can be positive, and I'm here to share today 2 experiences. One is sharing a process using peers as resources to help in their learning. Now, what I'm going to share with you is part of the AVID program, Advancement via Individual Determination, but we expanded it to include other students. And it's involving students in a tutorial process. We train our students to take Cornell Notes in their classes, which is basically 2-column notes with a summary. They avoid the summary like the plague, because the summary requires higher level thinking, but that's exactly where we need them to be. They're utilizing their notes to help identify them and identify what they may be struggling with academically. And from there, students complete a tutorial request form, which I'll show you in just a minute, with an initial question that is coming from their notes, from their homework, from their classwork, from a test. They go through identifying key vocabulary terms. They write what they do know about their question. And they actually enter into a stage of critical thinking about their initial question. They may go on to, if it's a math problem, they may show the problem or attempt to answer their initial question. And where they get stuck is what we call the point of confusion. That then becomes their revised tutorial question. Somewhat of a metacognitive process that's student-centered and then results in an inquiry-based Socratic process during the tutorial. Students are taught Bloom's taxonomy in order to practice asking higher-level questions. We've found sometimes the students learn that quicker than the teachers do, so it is a challenge to the teachers. Students are helping other students by referring to their resources. It could be their notes. It could be their learning logs, the text that they use, their recall in groups of the classroom instruction. This is a collaborative period that is built into the instructional day. This is a view, and I know you can't see the details, and what's in red was really what we use for training purposes. But this tutorial form is a form that they complete, going through the steps that I just explained. The bottom part of the form is a reflection. These students are required to reflect after the tutorial. They talk about what their point of confusion was, what did they learn about their point of confusion. Again, that metacognitive process entering in there. Now, I mentioned tutorial, and so often we think of that as remedial. And this tutorial process is not remedial at all. We're using this process, first of all, I believe very much in open access, and we are taking students who no one ever thought could be in advanced classes. They are placed in those classes, and they're not just put there and said, okay, now do it. They're put there with a strong support system from their peers and from the teachers. And so there's nothing remedial about it. These very students go on to high school, continuing in honors classes. They enter AP and dual enrollment classes. They're moving on to college, and not just with scholarships, but many of them, most of them with renewable scholarships. So we're really, really excited. In this process, we really see the power of peer pressure. When I entered and started working with this, we saw a school culture where it wasn't cool to achieve, and where many of the bright students wanted to avoid showing how bright they are. The culture changed. The culture changed using their peers to one where many, many students are achieving. This was a school where we did not have enough students who fell into a pass advanced category of our state assessment, our SOL, as it is in Virginia, to one where we count many students now in the pass advanced range. My second share demonstrates the power of student voice. As John Dewey, as we know, talked about schools being a laboratory of practice in democracy, citizenship is best learned with participation with peers. We need to provide these opportunities to students so they can increase their confidence in their ability to make a difference in their school community. What would you say if I said, I introduced to the staff a process where we were going to take 965 middle schoolers in groups of over 300 at a time and ask them, what's on your mind? Okay, you might think chaos. We wanted to ask them what needed to be done to improve their school, their community, the nation. Chaos? No, absolutely not. Yes, there were plenty of naysayers, but via student summits, we demonstrated to students and staff, and that's important, the staff, that young adolescents are very capable of making a difference in their school and community, and the power of peers came through again. We were out to raise student voice and participation, known as RSVP. Now, I didn't create this. This is a student engagement program sponsored by the National Association of Student Councils and the National Association of Secondary School Principals, NASSP. It's really designed for high school level, but in looking at that, I really believe that there was a middle school piece in here, so we modified that program some. We believe that students could be taught to use their voice appropriately, and they were capable of participating in this democratic dialogue that would result in actions on issues in their schools and community, and items that were important to them. In RSVP, basically the students are asked what's on your mind. They look at proposals for their school, proposals for their community improvement, and develop actions that can be taken in cooperation with adults to implement their ideas for positive change. To start this with middle schoolers, we took some student leaders, key student leaders, and I needed to prove to some people this could work. And we took student leaders and went through a mock summit to basically show that they were capable of doing this. From there, students brainstormed a process of how to make this happen with an entire student body. And they brainstormed ways to advertise the TV news and show on electronic bulletin board and signs around the school. They selected key staff members that they thought would have influence with the students and teachers. They wrote a script, and I did not want to put the middle schooler in. I was out to prove to teachers that this would work too, and I wasn't about to put the middle schooler in front of large groups of their peers. And so we decided that the students would tape their guidance segment of the summit. And you're going to see some quick snippets of that. But little did they know that they were teaching the adults a very, very important lesson, and that was how to run collaborative groups. They worked with some very talented teachers who helped prepare the videos to take them step by step, and I need to say that the summits were very, very successful. They're drafting a civic action plan. Our mayor has agreed. He wants to hear their voice, and what an authentic type of initiative. Here, he is coming in to listen to them, and the students are beside themselves. I know they're going to be discussing some very tough topics with our mayor. They're going to be talking about the gangs in their neighborhood and some of the violence outside of school. But again, powerful learning for our students. And once again, our students, our middle school students, coming from a school of many, many, many at-promise students, showed the influence of positive peer pressure. They showed that they could work collaboratively, respectfully. I'm not sure I could have gotten 300 plus adults together. And by the way, they worked in small groups. They worked in settings of about 5 to 8 students to do this. And their results were put together, and you will see their results in just a minute. The adults were amazed. They were chattering as much as the students were at the first summit. There have been multiple summits. But today, they do believe that young adolescents can use their voices appropriately. We actually had students lead a parent group in that mix. It's a group of parents, staff, and students coming together to show the power of one. And at Oscar Smith, we have seen a change in the culture, both behaviorally and academically. Yes, there's still a lot of work to be done, but Oscar Smith Middle has come a very, very long way in this process. And a school that people used to look down on, people now are taking notice. I have 2 minutes, I think it is, of video clips, and they're just that. They are glimpses. We have lots of video, but there was no way I could show you this. But just think about what I was sharing with you as their process. You'll see some of the advertisements. You'll see how they, just a snippet of how they ran the summits with the taped programming. You'll see how the results were shared very quickly, because one of the students said to me, "Are you really going to look at all of these ideas we come up with?" Yes, indeed. And that was summarized for them very quickly through the morning news. But then also they came back together to work on that. So at this time, I couldn't resist bringing our kids with me, and I'd like to share with you that snippet.
I shouldn't love you, but I want to. I just can't turn away. I shouldn't see you, but I can't move. I can't look away. Shouldn't love you, but I want to. I just can't turn away. I shouldn't see.
What's on your mind?
What's on your mind?
What's on your mind?
What's on your mind?
Great job. I hope your group had a positive discussion about what is going well here at Oscar Smith Middle School. I am Naya, and I am here to lead you through the next question. Turn the page of your poster to page number 2.
If you were in charge of your own city, town, or neighborhood, what issue would you tackle first?
Wage world, party time, excellent!
Hi, I'm Mrs. McCallum, Secretary at Oscar Smith Middle School. Your number 8 choice was clubs and activities.
I'm Mr. Anderson, Head Custodian at Oscar Smith Middle. Coming in number 7, the building is clean.
Hi, I'm Miss David, your chorus teacher here at Oscar Smith Middle School. And your number 6 answer is music.
Hi, I'm Mrs. Harris.
I'm Mr. Smith.
We're your technology support staff here at Oscar Smith Middle.
Your number 4 answer is technology.
Keep using that technology.
Hello, I am Katrina Little, Oscar Smith Middle School's Teacher of the Year for the 2011-2012 school year. And your number 1 pick are teachers.
Nathan Wilson reporting here with a bulletin from OSMS News. This just in, the top 10 national and global concerns collected from the students participating in the OSMS Summit held in April. Number 10, homelessness. Homelessness is a national problem that varies greatly.
Vice President, students need to have a voice in our school. We want to identify the needs of our student body.
We want to discuss the issues of our community.
We listen and know about national and global issues.
We have taken the first step. We have raised our voice.
And just a small view of what the students did to promote, to advertise, participate, and the bottom line is have a voice while teaching the teachers. Thank you.
I'll just talk really loudly. So do we have, oh, there we go. Whoa, questions from the panel? It's the end of the day. Yeah, Patrick.
No, we can take comments too. They don't have to just be questions. I notice we've been saying questions all day.
Sorry.
But that's not my comment. So to go to this thing at the end, which was a great way to end the day, because here's data, so to speak, that's very powerful. Did the kids talk about this about what this was like for them and what they thought this meant for their interest in school or their motivation to learn?
We only have more of a qualitative piece here, and there was chatter, but the chatter was not only from their peers, it was from the teachers. It was incredibly powerful. The students very impressed that their adults were listening to them, that they had a voice with their peers. They were being respected for their thought. They saw adults turn around and immediately summarize and report back to them. They were becoming a powerful voice in the school. The teachers, we proved a point. To all the naysayers that were out there who thought really that maybe I was a little crazy to take this high school concept it was about 325 students or more at a time, but it was perfect. I could not, we reflected, and there was nothing else that we would change from that day, but the students were just so excited and just listening to their chatter. And they asked the questions, as I said, are you really going to look at this? Is this really going to make a difference? And they saw when it came to the next summit that indeed it did. The next summit, they were prioritizing and developing plans. So it's only qualitative, what we were hearing.
And there was a question back there, yeah, or a comment.
Changed my mind. I'm just kidding. Okay. I'm June Jenkins, Project Director for Safe Schools, Healthy Students in Charlottesville and Albemarle. We do a lot of work with bullying prevention, and basically I have a commendation and then a suggestion. Dr. Brown, thank you so much for that acknowledgement about how important positive school climate is in addressing not only bullying prevention, but all of those other risk factors that our students are facing every day. The suggestion and request that I have for all of you wonderful researchers is please help us to get that message out to schools more about how directly that correlation of positive school climate and positive school culture relate to academic achievement. That's our point that we really need to be able to use with them in order to help them to more focus on and feel like that they have the time to focus on positive school values and culture. So thank you for your words.
Do you want to? Yeah.
Let me just reinforce what you just said in the sense that what we found is there are essentially multiple benefits, as you've suggested, to that, because once you get a level of student engagement and get a faculty that sees how encouraging it is to their own professionalism, it begins to have a snowball effect. And that's what gets really exciting. It's one thing to have a few teachers doing it, but to get the kind of effect we're talking about, it requires there's some kind of tipping point in terms of the majority of the faculty being committed to it. But that's where the reciprocity comes in, where they see kids being successful who weren't successful in other situations or venues. And then I think that you've got a chance of really having that shift take place, so that kids then become engaged because they see other kids being excited by stuff that's going on. And so you're beginning to shift the notion of what the peer culture values as well.
Anyone else? Question?
Are you ready for my question?
Yes. Oh, sorry, I couldn't see the mic.
I'm Noelle Hurd. Sorry. I'm an assistant professor in the psychology department here at UVA. And I was wondering, this is in relation to the video, but it would be great if any of the panelists wanted to comment on what appeared to be a little bit of a disconnect between some of the issues that we've been identifying as researchers or individuals working in the schools in terms of things that we want to improve or things that we think will help youth to do better in middle school. And from what I could read from some of the items on the list in terms of things that the youth identified as factors that they wanted to change or improve, I saw things like dress code, longer lunch periods, more free time, more sports. I'm not sure if those tie into some of the things that we were talking about, but how do you deal with that disconnect if in fact you see it as one? I'd be interested in anybody's perspective on that.
I think in this case, the students are responding to what directly impacts them. And that number one was lunch choice and different menus. But, you know, again, more opportunities for sports, things of that nature. But those are the things that they're dealing with on an everyday basis. It was a stretch for them to deal with the nation when they're starting to get beyond their immediate community. But I think in this case, it's the student's voice was what's impacting them, what they're dealing with on a daily basis. However, I think the research guides us in how to go about giving students this opportunity to have a voice. So I don't know if I'm explaining that clearly.
I agree. I mean, students are going to talk about what is their most immediate desire and priority. But if you get just a little bit below the surface on some of those things, and you think about why do they want more free time? Why do they want more sports? The cynical adult will say, well, it's just fun. But I think and it's not math, right? But if we look at what developmental need that's serving, right? And what's beautiful about this process, I wasn't familiar with it before, but what's beautiful about this process is it isn't just here's our priorities, take them, but it's here's our priorities, let's engage in a dialogue about them. I think some of those things could potentially come out, and hopefully I'm sure they did in terms of what's actually possible to do. And I find that when kids feel heard, they actually are very understanding of an adult perspective. And when they don't feel heard, that's when they're much less understanding. And I think that's not true just for kids, but that's true for everybody.
And a lot of people complain about the food, right?
I have another comment about that, which is that sometimes it's about building social trust. My guess is that there were probably in your school in the beginning, there were some people who didn't believe that you were going to follow through on what you said you were going to do. And once you do that, then other needs start to surface as well, and people begin to talk about things that that may be more complex or more difficult. One of the beautiful things about service learning, of course, is because it's attached to the curriculum, you can get pretty quickly to needs that are of different kinds because you're studying different kinds of issues. So if you're studying water resources around the world, then you start looking at issues at home as well. Another quick example of that, how kids can, once they feel empowered, they can take it seriously that they have a role to play. One of our middle schools, there was a child who died at home because of carbon monoxide poisoning. And so, of course, it was a tremendous tragedy. And so this was a school that already had a service learning history. And so then it became natural for the kids to look at ways to respond to the tragedy rather than just sending money somewhere or something. They got together and said, well, didn't they have a carbon monoxide tester in their home, a tool to use? And of course, they hadn't had that. So they said, well, what would it cost to do to get those? How could we get those in every home in the community? So long story short, they went into the community and got help and looked at getting good deals on carbon monoxide detectors. And by the end of the project, every family in the town had a carbon monoxide detector because of the middle school kids taking action based on this tragedy. So that you get that kind of, which you have the stage set, then kids realize that they can step up and make a difference.
Other questions or comments? All right.
Maybe we should say that's the end of the day.
Yeah. It's a long day.
Well, I have one other thing I'd like to add, because we have just a couple of minutes, because it came out of the last session and I didn't get a chance, and it relates to what we were talking about in terms of a lot of other people, the things the panel said. It came from the question of adaptive challenging that we heard, that we seem to be in a situation where our genetic history has predisposed this part of our age group so that adaptive challenges themselves may be an inevitable part of what kids need in order to keep developing. And I guess my question is whether that's in a different way of looking at risk-taking behavior. That is, if we think of risk-taking behavior, there's a negative connotation there, and yet it seems that may be a real developmental need that kids this age have. So then the question is, how can we recontextualize or rethink of that, what an adaptive challenge can look like? Because in my sense is that it's every bit as much a challenge for a kid to decide to play a sport that they may not be good at, or even to be involved in athletics when that may not be their strength. Or it's a real challenge for a kid to stand up in front of their peers and talk about something that's important to them. That those essentially, that's risk-taking behavior itself, even in a different context, and that we need to create the opportunities for kids to have that in a role where there is some risk involved, and that they will get as much of their needs met than through the destructive behaviors, so that it's the same kind of challenge in a way to take, can I drink until I fall over drunk? That's because that's what seems to be available to me to test this to be challenged. And so that if we create avenues for adaptive challenges, that may be important. In fact, my sense is that if we don't do that, kids construct their own adaptive challenges. I mean, I've walked into middle schools where the kids are in control of the school. You walk in and in 15 minutes you realize the adults seem to have given up. The kids are running the school. And they've invented their own adaptive challenge in a way that often is not very constructive. So if we don't create the possibilities for positive, constructive adaptive challenges, then I think we're asking for the other.
So, first of all, thank you, and thank all the panelists, and thank the people for participation today. This is one of those things that when you're halfway through a journey, you're not quite sure whether you know where you're going or not, and whether you're going to get there. But it seems to me that one of the things that we've done today is start to talk about this idea of, if you're going to be thinking about adolescence as capable, and particularly early adolescence as a time where there's a great deal of plasticity and opportunity to make big, powerful, positive impacts. How do we get adolescents more engaged actively in developing and managing and directing themselves? And how do we work with helping teachers to think about the best ways to do that, giving them the training that they need to do that? So your assignment for this evening is to try and help us think about that tomorrow. How would you help adolescents become more engaged and a bigger part of the active directive of their learning, direction of their learning at that age? But then how would we help teachers and administrators start to be able to think about how to do that? And while we're at it, let's help them become technologically savvy too. So tomorrow we'll start at 8:30 with breakfast. The panel will start at 9. For those who are going to the panelist dinner, we'll be meeting here in the lounge at 6:10 to walk over. And I'll give you my 25-cent tour of the lawn on the way over. So that's an added extra. So we look forward to seeing you for that. And for those who are not part of the dinner, if you go through these buildings and just through the next set, you'll get up on the lawn, and you should take the time to take a little walk over there. And if you're not from around here and haven't seen it before, it's a wonderful thing. Thank you.